Hi everybody, thanks for coming. Hopefully everyone on Zoom can hear me. Let us know if not. I'm going to try not to go over time, definitely no guarantees. But I'll try and zoom through things, and unfortunately I'm going to be reading a paper, and I know that's not ideal in this late hour on Wednesday, but couldn't be helped. So my paper title slightly changed just because I thought it was funny. So the new title is now, Isn't It Pretty to Think So? Which is the last line of Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises. But the more substantive title is On the Matter of Norms, Normativity and Value Form, from Brandom to Marx. I probably won't get to all those things I hoped to in the abstract, but we'll see how things go. Okay, I'm missing a slide, but whatever. So, in honor of the conference, I thought it would be interesting to begin something like Wilfrid Sellars does in Empiricism and Philosophy of Mind. So I'm going to start out with something that might look like a paradox of normativity by talking about a seemingly inconsistent triad. So consider the following propositions. Number one is that norms imply social judgments of correctness. Number two is that it must be possible to do otherwise than norms prescribe, that is to say, be wrong about them, disobey them, whatever. And finally, three, norms are causally efficacious, or norms are continuous with causal powers or dispositions. I'm not going to pretend that all of these are uncontentious, but for the purposes of the following, I think they're at least plausible on the face of it. So, by social judgments of correctness, I mean that the content of a norm cannot be reduced to, this will not be my position, by the way, overall, in what follows. It's just a way to set the stage. So, by social judgments of correctness, I mean that the content of a norm cannot be reduced to the subjective or intersubjective attitudes about that norm. If this were not the case, then judgments of correctness could not be extended beyond some subject in such a way that another could be rationally compelled to abide by them. Norms, in other words, imply social institutions. There must be something against which the implementation of a norm is set. In other words, if the content of the norm is relative to what those subjects to the norm take the norm to entail, then it seems there is no longer any ground for normative force to obtain, independent of their thinking it so. But if it is relative to their thinking it so, then there is no basis on which we could be wrong and hence right about a norm. This is what we might call Wittgenstein's problem. The problem of the inadequacy of subjective apprehension of a norm to generate the legitimate application of normative force opens a subsequent question. Through what is the content of the norm constituted, if not the mental content of those enacting the norm? That social judgments abide beyond their interpretations appears to entail that something must subsist independently of all particular acts instantiating the norm. This we might call Plato's problem, that Boris already walked us through, so that's nice. Here it would seem that some sort of existential grounds, other than sheer subjective attitudes, must be asserted as essential to any norm. Taking these last 2 points together, we can call these the formal and material grounds of the norm. So, note 2, something can be said to be normative only insofar as those enacting it are not externally compelled to act in accordance with it, if they are not only subject to the norm, but also subjects of the norm. A norm which someone is compelled by non-normative force to fulfill is not an agent of the norm, but rather a patient to the norm, and therefore not normatively participating in the norm. In order for a norm to be properly so-called to exist at all, it seems there must be some for whom the norm is compelled by no force other than the normative force licensed by the norm, or some other norm abiding in the same way. In other words, it must be possible to do otherwise than norms prescribe. So Scholium 3 is much shorter, which I'm sure you're grateful for. In order for norms to be considered real, they must be capable of producing effects. In other words, if norms are real, then they are causally efficacious. Okay, so the first argument goes as follows. If norms imply social judgments of correctness, whose content or meaning is not a matter of the interpretation of the individuals involved with them, then it is straightforward to show that given the limited powers of any given thinker to follow any norm in every possible circumstance, it must be possible to be wrong about norms, but only on the condition that following the rule of the norm is not itself subject to any strictly defined notion of efficient causation. That is to say, if we're calling something like a universal natural law a norm, it's dictated by metaphysical necessity, and then obviously we can't be wrong about it or disobey it in that sense. So since, and this is an interpretation of proposition 3, the correctness of norms follows from strict causal efficiency, the thing I'm arguing against, then it would be impossible to disobey, as I said. So therefore, if we construe the proposition that norms are continuous with causal powers in terms of strict efficiency, then 3 must be false if 1 and 2 are true. Number 2 is that if norms imply social judgments of correctness and norms are continuous with causal powers in line with, again, the idea of strict efficiency, then as already been stated, the proposition that it's possible to do otherwise than norms prescribes is false, because it just follows from what I've already said. So argument 3 is that finally, if norms are continuous with causal powers, and it's possible to be wrong about or disobey norms, then the interpretation of 3, strict efficiency of causes about norms, is false. But if strict efficiency is false in the causal sense, then it seems it becomes difficult to state precisely in what way norms imply social judgments of correctness, which are irreducible to their subjective apprehensions, since this seems to suggest that there are, strictly speaking, no facts of the matter regarding the content of the norm about which those subject to the norm can be right or wrong. So this we could call Kripkenstein's problem. In other words, if norms rise above causal constraint and efficient causation is the mechanism on which we attach the notion of a fact as something determinate, something thus and so, then prima facie, norms allied the propositional stricture needed to give meaning to social facts. Clearly, something has to give. So basically, the idea is here, if 1 and 2 are true, then we deny 3. If 1 and 3 are true, we deny 2. And if 2 and 3 are true, we deny 1. Again, with the caveat that we're understanding this in terms of that interpretation of causes as strict efficiency. Okay, so this leaves us with a dilemma. If we accept all 3 propositions as belonging necessarily to the concept of normativity, which I do, then the concept of normativity is incoherent, or there's something about our construal of the meaning of the terms of our propositions which is incorrect. If we assume that normativity is not an incoherent concept, there are 2 lines of interpretation that will be taken up here. The first is that of Robert Brandom, who understands the reason relations capable of adjudicating the social judgments of correctness of norms to be displaced onto the inferential content of individual reasoners in interpersonal relations between players in the game of giving and asking for reasons, or Bilgar, as we'll call it from now on. This interpretation bottoms out in a purely discursive form of rationality, since the normative structure is indexed exclusively to the conceptual content asserted, in Brandom's language, committed and entitled to, acknowledged and undertaken by individual thinkers. This gives rise to what I consider to be insurmountable problems in his theory of sociality. The second is that of Marx, in whom social form is based in the form determination of social practices which constrain the activity of individuals comprising the social relations which they themselves substantiate the form of. So the form is itself consequent upon the concretely particular acts which comprise it, but it also exerts normative force, as well as non-normative force, upon the acts of those individuals in advance by setting the conditions within which they normatively participate, those conditions again are both normative and non-normative. So here we'll take value form within capitalism as the case to be analyzed. In line with the first interpretation, if the first interpretation requires us to reformulate proposition 1, which is the social part of the judgment, that is to say, reformulating the meaning of social in the phrase social judgments of correctness in discursively interpersonal terms. The second requires us to formulate proposition 3, the effectiveness of norms, in such a way that shows how norms operate in material terms, which vitiate the effective voluntariness of our engagement in a social form without negating the voluntary nature of our entering into social relations prescribed by a given social form. In our case, that will be the wage relation. So we'll argue that the latter, Marx's theory, or what I'm going to take to be Marx's theory, is the more concrete realization in thought of normative structures in act, and therefore the superior theory, but that it poses difficult theoretical questions about whether collective self-mastery of social forms is possible. I won't get to that. There was a whole section on primitive accumulation that I had to cut out, but I'm happy to talk about it. Okay, so on to Brandom. So Brandom adopts a model of social relations cashed out in terms of interpersonal relations, which he thinks the person alone is involved in the kind of performances on which the normative force necessary for Gogar, game of giving and asking for reasons, can obtain. That is, acts of commitment and entitlement through which we hold ourselves and others rationally responsible and grant ourselves and others authority over such claims. According to him, arguments for a community assessment of norms, like those found in Wright and Kripke, either fall foul of these requirements or speciously project them onto a collective subject, which can ultimately only be explained by reference to relations between individuals. Finally, something to look at. Okay, so here's Brandom. The difficulty with communal assessments of normativity is that in assessing, endorsing, accepting, and regarding as right are, in the first instance, things done by individuals. This tendency to talk of the community as somehow having attitudes and producing performances of the sort more properly associated with individuals is neither accidental nor harmless. This façon de parler is of the essence of the communal assessment approach. It is a manifestation of the orienting mistake of treating I-we relations rather than I-thou relations as the fundamental social structure. Assessing and so on are things we individuals do and attribute to each other, thereby constituting a community, a we. But this insight is distorted by I-we spectacles, and then this is my emphasis, perhaps the same that have always been worn by political philosophers in conceiving their topic. The pretense of communal assessment is not harmless because the easy ways of cashing out the metaphor of community approval and so forth present familiar dilemmas. A notion of communal endorsement or repudiation might be built out of regularities of endorsement and repudiation by individual community members. But universal agreement is too much to ask, and how is it to be decided what less ought to count? So he's saying, unless everyone individually produces this assessment, there's no way to talk about communal assessment in normative terms. Okay, so furthermore, the basis of the individuality of specifically normative performances comes out of the structure of acknowledgement. With acknowledgement alone is responsibility possible, and responsibility is where normative force attaches for Brandom. What makes us act as we do is not the rule or the norm itself, but our acknowledgement of it. It is the possibility of this intervening attitude that is missing in the relation between merely natural objects and the rules that govern them. The slippage possible in our acting according to our conception of a rule is made intelligible by distinguishing the sense in which one is bound by a rule whose grip on us depends on our recognition or acknowledgement of it, as binding from the sense in which one can be bound by a rule whose grip does not depend on its being acknowledged. Brandom has this very circuitous way of talking, so hopefully that made some sense to somebody. Thus, Brandom's preferred idiom for normative pragmatics is understood in terms of what he calls I-thou relations, in contrast to those in whom human sociality takes the form of a we structure irreducible to such relations. Brandom's criticism of the latter is sensitive to the danger of the personification of the community in itself acting like a subject or agent capable of assessing, endorsing, accepting, etc., the normative attitudes held by individuals implicit in their performances. In this regard, Brandom is correct in assuming that there is no such collective agent, at least not of the type that engages in interpersonal discursive moves in Gogar. Right? So, that is, in terms of the way individuals are held to account for their actions by giving reasons and justifying what they do. However, this inflicts upon the model of I-thou relationships a problem of understanding what counts as justified and how it so counts, outside of the attitudes which each of the players hold, since, as we've seen, the normative force of responsibility is binding only insofar as we acknowledge its force on us. This poses a question of what, in Brandom's account, could play the role of a semantic content not dependent on our attitudes towards it. In other words, what could play the role of having an objective purport on which disagreements in the inferential scorekeeping of the entitlements and commitments between players in Gogar could be weighed against. In the pre-normative significances generated out of desire, Brandom, in his work on Hegel, gives us one such candidate, one that is still couched in terms of a pragmatic vocabulary that I want to uphold in what follows, but which is capable of taking on an objective purport. So, quote is, erectic awareness, sorry, there's lots of long quotes, has a triadic structure epitomized by relations between hunger, eating, and food. This is one example, of course. Hunger is a desire, a kind of attitude. It immediately impels hungry animals to respond to some objects by treating them as food, that is, by eating them. Food is accordingly a significance that objects can have to animals capable of hunger. It is something things can be for desiring animals. Eating is the activity of practically taking or treating something as food. It is what one must do in order to practice, in practice, to be attributing to it the desire relative erectic significance of food. Eating is the activity that is instrumentally appropriate to the desire of hunger. It is subjectively appropriate in that it is the activity hungry animals are in fact impelled to by being in the desiring state of hunger. And it is objectively appropriate in that it is an activity, a way of responding to environing objects that often enough actually results in the satisfaction of desire. So here's the important part. This distinction between two sorts of instrumental propriety of activity to desire funds a distinction between appearance and reality. For the objects responded to, a distinction between what things are for the organism, I'm going to skip some of that, and what things are in themselves. That is the significance they actually have. Anything the animal responds to by eating, it is being practically taken or treated as food, but only things that actually relieve its hunger are food. The possibility of these two coming apart is the organic basis for conceptual experience, which is, in its fully developed form, the collision of incompatible commitments. Okay, long quote, over. Here we would like to emphasize that the objective instrumental significance of the triadic structure of erectic awareness depends on the practical, read causal in this case, consequences for the subject taking the desideratum as the thing that would satisfy the needs of that subject. This is where, in a sense, Brandom begins his account, at least relative to the explanation of the conceptual work done by Hegel's for itself, in its self-distinction. But this is not where Brandom himself ends up. The situation of objective significance differs in the case of the full-blown normative activities involved in adjudicating incompatibilities of commitment between reasoners. For this, Brandom grounds objective conceptualization in the necessity for communication of ascribing to that of which different interlocutors speak something that is not determinable on the basis of the particular conceptual contents of the commitments undertaken of that which they speak. Complicated Brandomese, but this is basically what he means. To say it more plainly, Brandom sees there as a way of understanding what people are talking about without countenancing their own accounts for what they're talking about. If this were not the case, then there would be no basis on which speakers whose inferential commitments differed could be understood as taking up something common on which they could be said to disagree. However, I'll argue in what follows, in particular circumstances, this is precisely the situation we find ourselves in conflicts pertaining to social facts with which we are confronted, and more particularly in class conflicts. To get back to the immediate point, as Brandom puts it, thinking of the motivation for Quine's endorsement of quantification as securing existence claims as a way of overcoming Quine's own problems about indeterminacy of meaning. Another long quote here. Quine had taken it that meaning must at least determine inferential role. But what follows from endorsing a claim, what else that endorsement commits one to, depends on concomitant commitments that are available to serve as auxiliary hypotheses in extracting those inferential consequences. So the inferential significance of a belief depends on what else one believes. Thus, the unit of meaning should be taken to be a whole theory, not just a single sentence. But this means that if two interlocutors have different beliefs, they mean different things by the sentences they utter. On this account, it is not clear how the possibility of communication can be made intelligible as a matter of sharing meanings. But if attention is shifted instead to reference rather than sense, for the Phrygians in the root, the difficulty disappears. Weird example from Brandom here, but the Zoroastrian may mean something different by the word sun than I do. It has a different meaning in her mouth than in my ear because of the difference in her collateral commitments, but she can still be talking about the same thing, the sun. Equally significantly, though Rutherford may have meant something different by electron than I do, we can still be understood as referring to the same things, electrons, as classifying them as falling in the same extension, that of some subatomic particles. Excuse me. Okay, so here's the rub. What is expressed by de re specifications of the contents of beliefs of others is crucial to communication. I'll skip over some of this, but the end of it is this. The social dimension of inference involved in the communication of others of claims that must be available as reasons, both to the speaker and to the audience, in spite of differences of commitment, is what underlies the representational dimension of discourse. Okay. However, on my view, with an eye towards Marx, this does not get us out of the woods. And this is because we can always, in principle, exchange the idea that two speakers differ in what they mean, differ in their senses, by their use of the same sentences, by a difference in the objects, in other words, by a difference of what they refer to. The Rutherford example is instructive here when put next to other scientific examples. So while it may be true that in our rationally recollective reconstruction of the conceptual structure of scientific theory, we've chosen to understand Rutherford's electron as referring to the same kind of elementary particle that we ourselves take up in the Standard Model, despite the fact that Rutherford's sense of the electron is no longer the same as ours. However, in the case of things like phlogiston or ether or absolute Newtonian space, to which real hardworking physicists at one point referred, today we say that the objects of their conceptions were erroneous, not merely that they were mistaken about some properties of those objects, i.e., not just mistaken about the collateral commitments involved in speaking about such objects. So what might incline us in one direction rather than another? Well, I think the only legitimate answer to this question is going to be a story about the inferences licensed by our own collateral commitments, the very things that we were trying to avoid in appealing to de re ascriptions of propositional attitudes. So why do we think electrons still exist? Well, because we have good reasons to think so, and those are parts of our collateral commitments, whereas maybe things about phlogiston or whatever, we give up, right? So the fact that in certain cases we opt for referential continuity and sense difference rather than reference difference for the purposes of communication and extracting information about something that can then be used ourselves as being entered into our own inferential activity in the forms of premises and conclusions comes down to the practical affordances to us granted in doing so. But furthermore, and our ability to do so is subject to constraints determined by the material consequences of our doing so, in the same way that the success conditions for our taking as food in reality what is food are given by the consequences in the metabolic processes for the organism in extracting nutrients and calories, or rather remaining hungry, becoming ill, dying. So being right or wrong comes down to this causal process in this case. In other words, the socially inflected ascertaining of objectivity in discourse is ultimately parasitic on the more basic material consequences enshrined in the success conditions of the triadic structure of erectic awareness. How am I on time?
Close.
Okay. All right, so the last part's going to be a bit more speculative. So on to Marx then. Moving to our previous point, where the communicational paradigm of Brandom is couched in terms of a pragmatic metavocabulary falters on the question of objectivity. So let us consider ourselves the following question. What happens when, in the case of a critical social juncture, there's no self-evident social fact that allows us to rationally distinguish between de re ascriptions, referential ascriptions, and de dicto content? Such is the case, I argue, precisely with value form. So here, to use a word no longer in common coinage, we have a différance, right? Which it seems is presented by the very conditions within which the language game of value is set up, and is not something that can be resolved discursively only, since it is precisely in virtue of the conditions of that discourse that the paradox of sense occurs about the meaning of value, that is, about what value is in itself. So let us begin with a moment in capital. Sorry. Let us begin with a moment in capital where Marx puts on his best Brandomian drag, couching the use of the commodity of labor power as a battle of claims of right within the normative sphere of exchange. So Marx here, the capitalist maintains his rights as a purchaser when he tries to make the working day as long as possible, and where possible to make 2 working days out of 1. On the other hand, the peculiar nature of the commodity sold implies a limit to its consumption in terms of the time involved in a wage by the purchaser, and the worker maintains his right as a seller when he wishes to reduce the working day to a particular normal length. There is here, therefore, an antinomy of right against right, both equally bearing the seal of law of exchange. Between equal rights, force decides. Okay, here, of course, unlike Brandom, not every dispute is going to be resolved by an effort to coordinate our discourse so as to eliminate incompatible commitments between and within reasoners. Nevertheless, this pronouncement may sound strange in the mouth of Marx to some who expect him to tell us that the capitalist steals what he gets from the laborer by hook or by crook, which of course is not what he tells us. Instead, we see in certain cases that there is no normative mechanism which could adjudicate the equally valid but conflicting claims, because what is at stake is a social fact generated out of the social milieu within which such claims occur, and therefore the meaning of the social fact, what its sense is or what it can refer to, is not fully inferentially articulable as yet. Our knowledge of it has to be constructed. And this is where we can see that the impasse of claims about value extends not just to the use of labor power by the capitalist, but to the whole of value as such within the cycle of capitalist production and circulation. Marx insists over and over that the capitalist buys labor at full price and sells the commodity produced at full price. In this regard, the capitalist is a distinguished and upstanding normative participant in free enterprise. He swindles neither the worker at the site of purchase nor the consumer at the site of sale. It is for this reason that the capitalist claims by right, is entitled to in his own scorekeeping, the surplus generated out of valorization. And it is for the same reason that for the capitalist, surplus value appears as a miraculously self-generating process in exchange. But at the same time, given that all the capitalist does is buy and sell, it is evident to some extent in those engaged in socially productive activity, that is to say work or labor, confronted as they are with the commodities they produce in their alienable form, that value cannot occur in the sphere of circulation. Hence, again, a conflict of claims. The transformation of money into capital has to be developed on the basis of the eminent laws of exchange of commodities in such a way that the starting point is the exchange of equivalents. The money owner, who is as yet only a capitalist in larval form, must buy his commodities at their value, sell them at their value, and yet at the end of the process withdraw more value from circulation than he threw into it at the beginning. His emergence as a butterfly must, yet must not take place in the sphere of circulation. These are the conditions of the problem. Okay, in some sense, each has a one-sided view of the phenomenon, determined by the division of labor and one's relation to production, that is to say, one's class relation. So while labor as socially productive activity is solely articulable as the substance of value, for Marx, because it is precisely a norm-exit transition within which the human being causally realizes their self as the socially creative producer it is. This is the extended body. That is the joint agent capable not just of sheer social and biological reproduction, but of surplus as a condition of generic production, what I would call freedom. That is to say, locally negentropic processes of the amplification of our causal powers mediated by our socially coordinated alloplastic relations to nature, which mediation corresponds equally to the ampliation of the space of reasons in exit, re-entry, conceptual backpropagation. On the other hand, circulation alone makes value evident as a universal measure of work, and thus also a properly social fact. This is what valorization means. It is only as a collective property of the aggregate of concrete labors that abstract labor comes to establish itself as a homogeneous quantity derivable from the heterogeneous series of concrete labors, products, and use values. So value, so called, in its form of appearance, is then historically specific to the capitalist mode of production, but it reveals a measure for the transhistorical dimension of socially productive activity itself, which has one face in our normatively structured social practices, that which is the subjective significances which our products have for us as use values, but the other in the causally structured basis of our powers of production, as the objective significance those products have as the use values they are. In this situation, then, the capitalist plays a functional role for the automatic subject of capitalism as capital personified. He is, or they are, bewitched by money and by implication circulation, precisely insofar as self-valorization represents a repression, in the Freudian sense, of value on the level of the normative exit involved in the production of surplus on which it depends. So money in the MCM circuit is the form of recognition without substance in capitalist society because it is a warrant of a universal right to a certain quantity of cooperative social activity, which includes essentially causal powers only available socially. But it is that the capitalist concerned only with the accumulation of capital in indifference to the use values they could be exchanged for, in which the capitalist becomes drunk on recognition. He cannot find his way out of the normative fly bottle of exchange. This is because money already tokenizes the substance of recognition as socially cooperative enterprise that it itself lacks. As such, it bears the mark of all the potential any human could ever hope for. But the capitalist, this is the very end, but the capitalist fantasy can only be achieved by alighting the very social basis on which the tokening of recognition depends. The social basis is also already its material reality, whose success conditions cannot be understood except in the terms of the objective significance of our practical activities as weighed against the causal consequences of that activity for us. No inferential commitment in itself can vouchsafe this for us, but it also shows how non-normative elements come to play normative roles via normative entry and exit transitions in such a way that forces us also to expand normativity beyond the confines of strictly discursive activity. So in short, there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in Brandom's philosophy. Thank you.
I want to ask about this equal and conflicting rights, because Marx describes this like from above, but you don't see it from within, right? So would you say that from the perspective of the capital and from the perspective of labor, would it be that it's possible to see the equivalence of these different rights, or does it present itself as a kind of injustice, or on this side of the other?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, it presents itself as an injustice to the worker, obviously. And of course, Marx is going to side with the worker insofar as, insofar as abstract labor, or the way in which value is couched within capitalism, the substance of that value comes out of labor, concrete labor, not abstract labor. But it's only insofar as it's put into circulation that we see what makes concrete acts of labor something that can be members of the same class as abstract labor. So in a way, he's giving ground to something that the capitalist does in fact see but misunderstands as something miraculous about the market. But really what he's saying is that the market is the social institution in which the information is coordinated about a collective property of the social enterprise itself. That's how I view it. So some people view value as a negative thing for Marx. I don't think that's true. I mean, obviously he's against market economies in the capitalist formulation of them, but value does tell us something real about social production.
Okay, great.
Yeah, thanks.
Hi, thanks so much for that. That was really, really interesting. It's thick, but I really enjoyed listening. I do enjoy listening to papers and reading that out. I guess you used this phrase, I mean, this is kind of a clarificatory question, the norm-exit transition.
Yeah.
What's the function of that? I mean, I guess my immediate response was that, so that you were sort of positing that the entry into the process of production does it mean it's not normatively governed, or are we moving from? Yeah, I've had a question.
Right.
Like that.
I guess it's a good question. Obviously, I'm modeling on Sellars' idea of language exit and entry. So, again, thinking about normativity in Brandom's terms as something, at least as he understands. I mean, Brandom would probably give ground if you pushed him on it, like after he gave his talk or something, that like there's, so at the beginning of making it explicit, he gives this example of, like people like presenting a leaf to get inside of a tent, right? This kind of like, this sort of mythical example of like a primitive person. And instead of like having to sort of rationally adjudicate what they do, like you have the leaf, you get to enter. If you try to enter without the leaf, they bash you over the head with a club or something, right? But he rejects this idea as something that is suitably normative in the way that he wants to understand it. So what I'm trying to say is that by doing so, Brandom sort of confines himself to intra-language transitions in a way that makes it hard for him to ground a form of pragmatism that goes beyond just our conceptual contents in any way. Now, of course, he's an extremely sophisticated thinker, so I'm sure he would have things to say about my caricature of him. But I was taking normativity in that sort of sense, in the Brandomian sense. And so thinking about, in analogy with Sellars, the way in which the typical language exit transition is an action, right? Similarly, if we're thinking about, let's say, the language game or the normative game of exchange, right? That it's a circuit, but it's not self-enclosed, obviously, right? And ultimately, value depends on, even though the inversion of capitalism is to start and end with money. I think Marx thinks of financialization as a pathological thing, right? Like a direct M-to-M transition just can't account for the value that it's nominally supposed to encode, I guess, because it never goes into a commodity that's capable of actually either producing value in the case of labor or being the instantiation of productive activity and therefore being useful to us, right? So I don't know if that answers the question, but maybe I should try to massage the language a bit there to clarify.
Thank you.
Thanks.